It's hard to think about the modern history of Greater Boston without its ever-evolving civic infrastructure. Government, private, and nonprofit groups working together and alongside each other, often with some friction. But Boston has also been a hub of innovation for what it looks like when civic foundations really get into gear, and the rest of the country has been watching. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is The Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Paul Grogan, civic staple in Greater Boston and former longtime president and CEO of the Boston Foundation, and Kathy Merchant, former president and CEO of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. Together, they wrote Paul's memoir, Be Prepared to Be Lucky, Reflections on 50 Years of Public and Community Service. 50 years is a long time to get through, so we will jump right in. Paul, Kathy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thanks for your interest.
So Be Prepared to Be Lucky isn't just a nice turn of phrase. Like everything else in this book, there's a story behind it. So who wants to jump off? Where did Be Prepared to Be Lucky come from, and what does it mean?
Well, it is a product of the renowned poet and essayist E.B. White, author of Charlotte's Web, and in an essay in which he was counseling a young man who was about to go to New York to make his fortune. E.B. White said, well, if you're going to New York, be prepared to be lucky. And if you think about that, it is a kind of recipe for success. Most of us are created with several parts. There's the part that gets done to us in the course of a lifetime and the part that we do to others. And obviously, controlling your own existence, being able to take advantage of opportunities is very, very important. Being ready is an acknowledgement that these different components come together to form a human being. The interesting thing is whether you can affect it or not. And this goes beyond just being lucky. It's a watchfulness about the environment around you and what you're doing, and an ability to respond to opportunity that presents itself that might not if you didn't have that sensibility or that state of mind of recognizing that's how the world works, and I'm going to turn that to my advantage as much as I can. And that's the fragment of a longer quote, but it's amazing how interested people are in that. It is ambiguous. What really does this mean? And it's been good for the book, actually, that people are curious and interested, as you were, about this title.
It reminds me a lot about either pessimistic preparation or, anticipatory optimism or something like that, basically saying that it's not just letting something come to you, but kind of almost physically gearing yourself up for when that right circumstance, that right set of events comes to you, then you can kind of jump on it. So it's not just crossing your fingers and hoping that everything works out, but being ready for that key moment.
Yeah. That's it. You've got it.
And so what has luck meant kind of as a broad concept in the context of your career when you think about maybe the first lucky moment that you were prepared for?
Well, a big lucky moment occurred when I was drafted in a kind of emergency to give a speech that someone else was slated to give but could not be there. And there was no chance really to get a new speaker of the kind we wanted, which was a businessman or woman of real stature. And I was doing this work with another business CEO, Bill Edgerly of State Street Bank. And we were talking about, well, what are we going to do about this? And, we got to find another business leader. And he said, you're doing the speech to me. And I said, no, we can't do it. He said, you give the speech. And that sort of ended the debate, and I agreed reluctantly to make the speech. The speech went incredibly well. And sitting in the audience was the retiring president of LISC, and they were in the middle of the search process. And he went back to the search committee in New York and said, I've got your new president. It's Paul Grogan. You can just think of how that opportunity in the end finally presented itself. There's a lot of luck, but I had to write a good speech.
Right.
A great speech.
You couldn't just walk out and wing it.
Right. So I think that anecdote really illustrates what we're talking about here. Everybody's got some responsibility. Things don't happen automatically, but you're not completely passive either. You can do things. And as I said, it's tickled us that it's been so interesting to people.
So, Kathy, the Cincinnati Foundation, in part, is very connected to the work of the Boston Foundation,
Indeed.
both in thinking about the way that it's modeling and adapted some of the policies and practices there. But how did this book actually come about? What made you want to write it? What was your initial connection to each other?
Well, I was prepared to be lucky when Paul and his wife and I had
Ruthlessly prepared.
ruthlessly prepared.
Mercenary.
Yes, no, not exactly. But we had dinner together in Bologna, Italy, in October of 2022. And Paul just sort of randomly in dinner conversation leaned over and said, I've been thinking about writing my memoir. And I practically jumped out of my chair and said, I'd love to help you. He called a month or so later, not even, and said, do you really want to help me do this, or was that the wine talking? And I said, well, it very well could have been the wine. We'd had plenty, but I really wanted to do it for a variety of reasons. I had published 3 books already, so I was well prepared to be an author, and Paul knew that. And our careers are not mirror images of each other, but there are a lot of parallels. And so there was little backgrounding and acronym explaining that Paul would need to do if he partnered with me on this project. And the partnership was appealing. Paul could have done his own memoir, and we chose a methodology that really made it seamless for us, which was to record our interviews together to frame the book, and then to record 25 or so interviews with others to add and to amplify his stories, and then also to say the wonderful things about Paul that he probably really shouldn't, even if he wanted to, say about himself. But there was this remarkable consistency that emerged that actually made its way into the book and the insights and the lessons over time. So we kind of recast those views of others into the stories that Paul so beautifully tells in the book.
So thinking about a memoir, there are plenty of altruistic reasons and plenty of self-serving reasons that someone might want to look back on their career. What were you two going in with the hope of here? Is it kind of looking at your life and your career in sort of the long lens and placing it in Boston history? Was it an inspirational forward-looking question? I'm sure it's a combination of all of these.
It is. What stayed constant throughout this is that we both had a core set of interests that we had pursued, sometimes together, sometimes separately, but a core set of interests involving community development and so forth. And so there was that we had from the beginning. But I think for me, it was, I wasn't interested in money. In fact, I'm doing this pro bono myself. I didn't want a job. So I think it was really, I wanted to see if I could have just a little more influence and play some role in keeping this movement on the kind of role that it is now with respect to this whole civic leadership model that we've helped invent over the years. So for me, it was that, because you can feel like you have nothing to do, nobody's going to call you, and this has been a tremendous thing to do at this point. The other thing I would say about it is, we talk about we've had different jobs, but they're really all the same job. Is as I say, keeping a strong, productive interest in those things that you think you can still make a difference on. And this book, a big part of the motivation for both of us, I think, was to do something for the whole field that would be, if not powerful, be compelling and worth doing, and help school some new generations of folks who get interested in this work.
So you may find it amusing that initially Paul's vision of the memoir was something that he could share with his family in the future. And I probably got a little bossy in that moment. And I was like, no way. Your story is so much bigger than that. Paul was a mentor to me and to the entire field of community foundations. As soon as Paul took, in particular, the Boston Foundation job, we all lined up like lemmings to say, how is he getting this done? He is transforming a traditional community foundation, which frankly most of us were running, and we wanted to have a piece of that knowledge, and Paul gave that willingly, to the point that today, some 90% of all community foundations follow a degree of a civic leadership model. That's because of Paul.
The book does dwell a lot on the concept of what leadership looks like, and you had a number of models of potential leadership going back to your time in City Hall from when you were, was it 24 when you first came on under Mayor Kevin White as
Yes.
a policy researcher? So you talk a bit about what Boston felt like at the time, and it's a lot of kind of grim words. Of course, people have a very recent memory at the time of some of kind of the worst types of urban renewal, but you talk about why that's also kind of a mixed concept as well. But also, the tensions around busing are very recent and ongoing. So what was it at that time when you were looking around at this landscape that maybe felt bleak, that made you want to enter it,
Yes.
enter the policy space?
Well, I think that's right. There was a lot of bleakness in those days, the very visible bleakness of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. But really more than that, a city in decline, losing population, jobs, housing, investment. Boston, you could make an argument that the city was dying. And of course, all the major northeastern and mid-Atlantic cities suffered some degree of decline during that period. We don't need to go there, but the city was in terrible shape. I joined an administration that wanted to fix it, wanted to turn it around, and it was very much a reformer ambition that infected the Kevin White administration when he was mayor. And he brought in young talent. Boston was a staid place, and he located some remarkable people. The most famous is Barney Frank, who was Kevin White's first chief of staff, and long before I got there. But so there was this, not only this kind of grim outlook, but there was at least not more than hope, some sense that we could do something, we can move this, and I was moved by all the problems, and certainly they were daunting, but the fact that we got some things in motion pretty quickly, and there were people involved who won the admiration of the public beyond the mayor himself. And, hope is contagious, and there was enough of that for us to kind of keep that fire burning and until we could get more done.
Mayor White was notoriously kind of a tough boss for many folks. Was there a particular indication of either his approach to you and kind of pushing you or giving you running room to go pursue the things that you were interested in that really stands out if you were going to take a lesson in leadership from the White administration?
Well, we talked about the importance of talent and skill. Another piece is expectation, though, and asking you to do more than maybe even you think you can or are qualified to do. And whether that was good for the public to have those young people, brash young people, I have to leave that question to history. But it was infectious, and the phrase I use with Kevin is defiant optimism. Defiant optimism. Not a lot of reason for it, but we're going to have it anyway. But he was a very tough boss, and he was volatile, and he was not a mean person, but he was capable of being mean at times. And so if you're going to work there, and particularly in some proximity, you're going to take ship some water. I mean, and that just came with the package. And if you couldn't do that, you couldn't be around him. He could also be pretty witty in a biting way. There was one incident I remember where I was participating in a very high-level meeting at City Hall, and I made a comment. I can't really remember what it was, but I made this comment, and the mayor regarded this as the dumbest thing he had ever heard, and he turned and looked at me and said, "Paul, we're over here playing baseball, and you're looking for a football helmet.
Oof. Get
in the game." So you can imagine, at that point I was 25 or 26. Get your football helmet.
And during this period, of course, you were put in charge eventually of these very significant agencies that really depended on kind of threading that needle between city leadership and community engagement, and what does it mean to both be responsive to a community and also kind of try and innovate, try and move the ball essentially down the field, whatever sport you're playing, not just from the White administration, but into the Ray Flynn administration. And then, of course, on to additional time heading up LISC, as you mentioned. I am curious, kind of at that stage in your career, how were you thinking about what the responsible way to approach civic leadership and civic engagement was? Because as we've discussed, there were a lot of political tensions in Boston at the time that were a bit tricky to navigate.
Right. And, some people are on the level and some people aren't serious. And working directly in communities, which I did for a number of years, you really have to develop your detection skills, who's on the level and who's for real and who is posturing or actually causing problems. A way to actually do that, I found, is within a group, a coalition, to find a few people who are good people and, if appealed to in the right way, would actually potentially be an ally to you in accomplishing something and bringing other community leaders forward. So it's very much a philosophy of reject the radicals and play to the moderates, and that's how you can perhaps get something done. But that's a lot of people are not patient with that. It's hard. There are more losers than winners, and but it's absolutely critical to the jobs I had, and I've just been very fortunate that I just have this gene. I don't know what it is, but I get along very well with people, and I've done particularly well in the minority community, being a white person who has power, who's trusted and can be relied on. That's so important, and I really do. I take some pride in what, in every place I've gone, what I've been able to do there.
And Jen, if I may, that's when we interviewed people to talk to us about Paul. That's among the bucket of very consistent things that they described about him, that if we'd known to call him an influencer and to use the power of influence and not authority at that time, that's how we would describe him. Everybody was consistent in his ability to use that gracefully, and it really worked. And I would add to that, partnerships. I mean, Paul really helped to invent public-private partnerships in Boston. A number of people who are from Boston attested to that. And, if you cultivate those relationships and find the common ground, find your allies, it's much easier to get things done than trying to be on a battleground with all those people all the time. And Paul was really good at that.
For those of us who haven't been in Boston for the better part of a century here, most of us might be familiar with your work on the Boston Foundation, which is, of course, the connection between the two of you. And so, Paul, you headed up the Boston Foundation for the better part of 2 decades, from the early 2000s to 2020. I am curious from both of you, but particularly when you were getting started, this was an old organization. It was founded in 1915. So what were the metrics for success? What was the measurement that you were looking at as you kind of moved into leading the Boston Foundation that seemed like it could make it effective at the time? And then as you spent more time there, did those metrics change? Did the way that you were thinking about potential impact change?
Absolutely. And it's very difficult to measure impact. The things you're engaged in are often things that change only over a snail's-based time. Nevertheless, it's very important to push to be literate about what your objectives are and how you will know whether or not you're reaching them. And just the act of saying those things improves an organization right there. And there are an awful lot of organizations, particularly governmental and nonprofit organizations, where in business there's ultimately one metric. Are you making money or not? There are a gazillion ways to look at and measure nonprofit organizations. But I would argue that makes struggling with it even more important, rather than saying this is too hard, we're going to do our work and hope something positive happens. So it's one of the instructions I give young people on this is it's really embracing the idea. And I think it's very important for donors and supporters to see this as well, that they're taking your resources and doing something important with them. So that's a crucial one. Honored in the breach, I'm afraid, more often. And it leads people in the business community sometimes to be contemptuous of the nonprofit sector. I think in Boston, we have so many remarkable nonprofit organizations that people know about. We don't have that sort of contempt or haughtiness about for-profit versus nonprofit nearly as much as exists in a lot of other communities. And if you look at what the role has been in building the Boston of today, which, whatever problems we have, you mentioned, 15 years ago, what was the city like? And it was the disaster that we described. And scarcely a generation later, it's the Boston of today. You really can't imagine this city, which is just beautiful and sparkling and doing all these great things. It was a disaster, but we came back from it. And that's another part of it that I think is very important. It's being willing to celebrate accomplishments when they do come. And that's another thing the nonprofit and public sectors don't do as well as they should, is really understand that the way to keep people in touch with things is not by giving them voluminous reports. It's finding other ways to communicate the essence of what's happening and what people are attempting, and that you're willing to be measured, and here's the right way to look at whether we are succeeding or not.
So, Kathy, I'm going to give you a second here to give Paul his flowers, but also the flowers of the other, foundations that you've been in conversation with and that have evolved over the years, which is, what was it that the Boston Foundation was doing that when all of you lovely lemmings looked at it, you went, we should try to be doing that too? What was it modeling?
So I know Paul just said that burying people with reports is not necessarily the most effective way to make change, but it is a part of the change process. So there were two things in particular that were happening here that everybody started to copy, myself included. One was benchmarking, and there's two aspects to the benchmarking. You to yourself, like the annual housing report, which Paul started, and you to other cities. There is nothing better to get people's juices flowing than to realize, oh dear, we're like way behind, so-and-so city that we admire. So that was one thing. And then the use of data and reports on specific subjects to create the facts, not the perceptions, not the wish for, but the facts, and convene people around that to articulate a solution was powerful. So those were two big things that we copied. I copied them just shamelessly, and it really helped us work on some really big issues. Cincinnati is not like Boston in that it's one city in a tri-state area of 2 million people. It's really kind of challenging to get anything done in that way, but these tools helped us make progress that, we're still working on today, but those were just examples of some of the tools.
So, thinking about this next generation of leaders, I'm struck thinking back to kind of how you started in this entire field, Paul, which is that it does take, to some extent, that amount of luck, that not only do you need a city that is trying to make a change, you also need someone who is willing to, give the younger people a chance to step into it and then give them some running room, essentially, to go and pursue that. I guess I'm curious to what extent, thinking back on your life, how have you thought about whether or not that was a replicable model? Is that the type of leadership that depends this sort of city in crisis or this element of bleakness, or is there a way to kind of bring young civic leaders into this process when they might look around Boston and say, this doesn't seem like a disaster? We have housing woes, there's education problems, we can always do more, but is there something very specific and crystallized about how you got into the game, or is there something that's a workable parallel now?
Well, we talked a little bit about opportunity before, but that's a very important part of responding to what you just said is there a way to get started here? What's going on? And to be in touch with people who are serious about doing something and are capable of attracting support for their vision of what to do. I think it's important that people recognize that the kind of reform energy or processes we've been talking to can come from anywhere. It's not necessarily public sector. In fact, often the public sector is in the way. It could be a neighborhood-based organization, a larger nonprofit. There's much more public-private cooperation than there used to be. Foundations didn't want to work with foundations, and that's changed enormously. So I think it's kind of confusing because there isn't an exact science of that. But the good news is there's space in these organizations for something to happen and to secure opportunities.
And I think one other point that you've made in the book in Chapter 8, which is really the big invitation for young people to join public and community service, is pick something that you're passionate about. There is plenty to do. It may be different today than it was in Boston in the 1970s. The issues evolve, the context changes, but there is something for you to do to make a meaningful difference. And if you have the ambition to make a difference and you're willing to intensify your effort to make that difference, that's like a little triangle recipe for success.
Thanks again to Paul Grogan and Kathy Merchant for joining me on the podcast. Thank you for listening, and of course, Be Prepared to Be Lucky is available on Amazon if you would like to read it. I'm Jennifer Smith, our producer is John Gee. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to drop us a note. We love hearing from you. We'll be back in your ears next week.